The faded serpent tattoo wrapped around Lena Brooks' forearm had been the source of countless jokes at Camp Pendleton. New recruits would snicker, calling it a garage special, or worse. But when Colonel Vincent Nash caught sight of that same mark during a routine inspection, his face went white as desert sand. Without hesitation, he stripped off his jacket, revealing an identical tattoo on his shoulder. "She's not logistics," he whispered to his aide, his voice trembling. "She's former Unit Meridian. Only 6 of us made it out alive." What happened next would shake the very foundations of everything the Marines thought they knew about the quiet woman who fixed their vehicles. The California sun beat down mercilessly on the motorpool at Camp Pendleton, casting harsh shadows between the rows of military vehicles that stretched across the compound like metal monuments to American might. Lena Brooks wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her grease-stained hand, leaving a dark smudge across her forehead as she bent back over the engine of a Humvee that had been giving the mechanics trouble for days. The sound of her wrench clicking against metal rang out in a steady rhythm, punctuated by the distant shouts of drill instructors putting recruits through their paces on the nearby parade ground. Lena had settled into a comfortable routine of anonymity within the sprawling military base. She arrived each morning, punched her time card, and disappeared into the maze of vehicles where she could work in relative peace. Her colleagues knew her as reliable, competent, and refreshingly drama-free, a woman who could diagnose engine problems with an almost supernatural intuition, and who never complained about the long hours or the backbreaking work that came with keeping hundreds of military vehicles operational. What they didn't know, what nobody at Camp Pendleton suspected, was that Lena Brooks had once been someone entirely different. The woman who now spent her days elbow-deep in engine grease had previously moved through shadows, in places most people couldn't pronounce, carrying out missions that would never appear in any official military record. The transformation from that life to this one had been deliberate, calculated, and absolutely necessary for her survival. The tattoo on her left forearm served as both a reminder and a burden, a piece of permanent ink that connected her to a past she had worked desperately to leave behind. The design itself appeared deceptively simple, a minimalist serpent, coiled around a compass rose rendered in fading black ink that suggested it had been applied years ago by someone who valued function over artistry. To the casual observer, it looked like the kind of tattoo a young person might get, on impulse perhaps during a wild weekend, in some military town where tattoo parlors stayed open late to catch sailors and Marines looking to commemorate their service with permanent reminders etched into their skin. The reality was far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. Private Rodriguez was the first to comment on it. Barely into his deployment to Camp Pendleton, fresh out of boot camp with the kind of cockiness that only came from surviving 13 weeks of controlled hell, he spotted the tattoo while Lena was reaching into the engine compartment of his unit's transport vehicle. "Nice ink, Brooks," he said with a smirk that suggested he found the whole thing amusing. "Did you lose a bet or something? That thing looks like it was done with a ballpoint pen." Lena didn't look up from her work, her fingers continuing to probe the engine's innards with practiced efficiency. "It's functional," she replied simply, her voice carrying the kind of flat disinterest that usually discouraged further conversation. But Rodriguez was young and hadn't yet learned to read the subtle warning signs that more experienced Marines recognized instinctively. Functional how he pressed, emboldened by what he mistook for shyness. "Does it help you fix trucks better? Maybe it's like a magic mechanic charm or something." His comment drew chuckles from the other recruits who had gathered around to watch the interaction, their laughter carrying the edge of cruelty that young men often displayed when they thought they had found an easy target. The sound of their mockery drifted across the motorpool, reaching the ears of Sergeant Patterson, who was conducting his daily equipment inspection with the methodical thoroughness that had earned him 3 stripes and the respect of his superiors. Patterson had been watching Lena work for months now, and while he had noticed the tattoo, he had also noticed something else, something that the younger Marines were too inexperienced to detect. There was a quality to the way Lena moved, a controlled precision in her gestures, and a constant awareness of her surroundings that spoke of training that went far beyond standard military vehicle maintenance. Rodriguez Patterson barked, his voice cutting through the laughter like a blade through silk. How about you worry less about Brooks's tattoos and more about learning to do your job without breaking something expensive? The rebuke was sharp enough to scatter the gathering crowd, but Patterson caught the brief flash of gratitude in Lena's eyes before she returned her attention to the engine, and he filed that moment away in the part of his mind where he stored observations that didn't quite fit the official narrative. As time passed, the comments about Lena's tattoo became a running joke among certain circles of the base. New arrivals would invariably notice it and feel compelled to comment, as if the simple act of acknowledging its existence somehow established their place in the base's informal hierarchy. Some suggested she should have it covered up or removed. Others speculated about its origins, with the kind of creative storytelling that flourished in military barracks, where gossip was one of the few forms of entertainment readily available. Lena endured it all with the same stoic patience she brought to every other aspect of her carefully constructed new life. She had learned long ago that drawing attention to herself in any way, even to defend against mockery, was a luxury she couldn't afford. The tattoo was visible, unchangeable, a permanent marker of her past that she had accepted as part of the price of her current existence. Better to let them think it was meaningless, a youthful mistake, or a memorial to some forgotten boyfriend, than to reveal the truth about what those intertwined symbols really represented. The serpent wrapped around the compass wasn't just decorative art. It was a mark of membership in something that officially didn't exist, a brotherhood forged in places where maps ended and GPS signals couldn't penetrate. Unit Meridian had been created in the shadows between different branches of military intelligence, a small team of specialists tasked with operations that were too sensitive for conventional forces and too dangerous for regular special operations units. They worked without official backing, without recognition, and without the safety net of government acknowledgement if things went wrong. And things had gone very, very wrong. The memory of that final mission still visited Lena in the early hours before dawn, when the base was quiet and her mind couldn't distract itself with the familiar rhythms of work. She would lie in her narrow bunk in the enlisted women's quarters, staring at the ceiling, while her subconscious replayed fragments of that night in vivid, unwelcome detail, the sound of automatic weapons fire echoing off canyon walls, the acrid smell of burning fuel, the weight of a wounded teammate across her shoulders as she struggled through terrain that seemed designed to kill anyone foolish enough to attempt passage. 7 people had gone into those mountains. Only 6 had come out, and 2 of those hadn't survived the extraction. The official story, insofar as there was an official story at all, attributed their mission to a training accident in a remote area of Nevada. The casualty reports were buried in classified files that would remain sealed for decades, and the surviving members of Unit Meridian were quietly reassigned to positions where they could be monitored and contained. Lena's reassignment to vehicle maintenance at Camp Pendleton had been presented as a reward for her service, an opportunity to use her technical skills in a safe environment, while the military decided what to do with someone who knew too much about operations that had never officially occurred. She understood it for what it really was, a comfortable form of house arrest, where she could be useful without being dangerous, where her skills could contribute to the larger military machine, while her knowledge remained safely contained within the boundaries of a base where every conversation could be monitored and every movement tracked. The routine of her new life had a numbing quality that she found both comforting and disturbing. Each day followed the same pattern, the same faces, the same problems that could be solved with the right tools and sufficient patience. She had become expert at diagnosing mechanical failures, at understanding the complex systems that kept military vehicles operational under conditions that would destroy civilian counterparts. There was something deeply satisfying about working with machines that responded predictably to proper maintenance, that followed logical rules and could be repaired with skill and determination. Unlike the human machinery of covert operations, vehicles didn't lie, didn't betray their teammates, and didn't leave their people behind in hostile territory when political considerations outweighed moral obligations. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had found peace working on machines designed for war, while trying to forget her experiences in actual combat. The Humvees and transport trucks she maintained would carry Marines into dangerous situations, but they would do so openly as part of officially acknowledged operations with clear chains of command and established rules of engagement. The men and women who depended on her work would have the backing of the United States government medical support if they were wounded, and recognition if they were killed in service to their country, all things that Unit Meridian had been denied. Colonel Vincent Nash arrived at Camp Pendleton, his presence announced by the kind of administrative flurry that accompanied high-ranking officers wherever they went. Word spread quickly through the base that they had a new commanding officer, a career Marine with an impressive service record, who had specifically requested assignment to Pendleton after completing a tour in the Pacific that had earned him commendation from the Joint Chiefs themselves. Nash was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in difficult places doing difficult things. His gray hair was cut in the regulation style that made him indistinguishable from a dozen other colonels. But there was something in his eyes, a particular quality of watchfulness, that suggested he had seen more than his fair share of action beyond the reach of conventional military operations. His first week at Camp Pendleton was spent in the kind of meet and greets that were standard for new commanding officers. Formal introductions to department heads and informal conversations with senior enlisted personnel who could provide him with the kind of unvarnished assessment of base operations that never appeared in official reports. Nash approached these interactions with the methodical thoroughness that had characterized his entire military career, asking detailed questions and listening carefully to the answers while forming his own impressions of the base's strengths and weaknesses. It was during his second week, while conducting a comprehensive inspection of base facilities, that Colonel Nash first encountered Lena Brooks. The motorpool inspection had been scheduled, giving the maintenance staff enough time to prepare their work areas for the kind of scrutiny that commanding officers were famous for applying to every aspect of base operations. Sergeant Patterson had spent the morning ensuring that every tool was in its proper place, every work order was properly documented, and every member of his team understood the importance of making a good impression on their new commanding officer. Lena approached the inspection with the same quiet professionalism she brought to everything else, making sure her work area was clean and organized, while mentally preparing to answer questions about vehicle maintenance schedules and repair procedures. She had participated in dozens of similar inspections over the years and understood the routine well enough to know that the key to success was demonstrating competence without drawing unnecessary attention to herself. Colonel Nash moved through the motor pool with practiced efficiency, stopping at each workstation to examine equipment and ask questions about operational procedures. His questions were intelligent and specific, revealing a deep understanding of military logistics that impressed the maintenance staff and put them at ease with their new commanding officer. He seemed genuinely interested in their work and appreciative of the challenges they faced in keeping hundreds of vehicles operational on a daily basis. When he reached Lena's workstation, she was in the process of replacing the transmission in a transport truck that had suffered a catastrophic failure during a training exercise. The work required her to position herself partially underneath the vehicle, her arms extended upward as she worked to disconnect the heavy transmission from the engine block. The position left her forearms exposed, and the serpent tattoo was clearly visible in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the motor pool. Nash stopped walking. For a moment, that stretched longer than it should have. The colonel simply stood there, his eyes fixed on the tattoo, with an intensity that was completely at odds with the casual nature of the inspection. The change in his demeanor was subtle but unmistakable, a sudden stillness that suggested he had seen something that challenged his understanding of the situation in a fundamental way. Sergeant Patterson, who had been providing a running commentary on maintenance procedures, noticed the colonel's sudden silence and followed his gaze to where Lena was working. "That's Brooks, sir," he said, assuming the colonel's attention had been caught by her unusual positioning under the truck. "One of our best mechanics. She's got an instinct for diagnosing problems that I've never seen matched." Nash didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer to where Lena was working his movement, careful and deliberate, in a way that suggested he was processing information that went far beyond routine inspection protocols. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality that hadn't been present during the rest of the inspection, a careful neutrality that somehow managed to convey both authority and uncertainty. "Brooks," he said, and there was something in the way he pronounced her name that made Lena freeze in the middle of loosening a bolt. "Could you step out from under there for a moment?" The request was phrased politely, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a direct order from a superior officer. Lena carefully set down her tools and slid out from underneath the truck, coming to attention with the automatic precision that was drilled into every member of the military from their first day of basic training. Her eyes met Nash's briefly, before shifting to the regulation position, slightly above and to the right of his shoulder, but that brief moment of eye contact was enough to confirm what the colonel had already begun to suspect. He had seen those eyes before in a classified briefing room, in a building that didn't officially exist, as part of a mission that had never been formally acknowledged by any branch of the military. "At ease," Nash said, though his own posture remained rigid with the kind of tension that came from recognizing a face from a past that was supposed to stay buried. His gaze shifted to her forearm, where the serpent tattoo was clearly visible now that she was standing upright, and for several seconds, the motor pool was filled with the kind of silence that made everyone present acutely uncomfortable. Sergeant Patterson cleared his throat, clearly sensing that something significant was happening, but unable to understand what it might be. "Sir, is there something specific about Brooks's work that you'd like to discuss? Her performance reports have been exemplary, and she's never had any disciplinary issues." Nash seemed to remember where he was and why he was there, though his eyes never left the tattoo on Lena's arm. "What's the significance of that tattoo, Brooks?" He asked, his voice carefully controlled, in a way that suggested the answer was far more important than the casual nature of the question would indicate. Lena felt her heart rate increase, but her expression remained neutral as she considered her response. This was the moment she had been dreading since the day she had been assigned to Camp Pendleton, the inevitable confrontation with someone who might recognize the significance of the mark she carried. She had hoped it would never come, that she could complete her unofficial exile in anonymity and eventually transition to civilian life without ever having to explain what the serpent and compass represented. "It's personal, sir," she replied, using the kind of non-answer that was technically truthful while revealing nothing of substance, a reminder of past experiences. Nash studied her face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't quite fit together. There was recognition in his eyes, but also confusion, as if he was trying to reconcile the woman standing before him with someone he had known in a completely different context. The tension in his posture suggested that whatever memories the tattoo had triggered were not entirely pleasant ones. "Past experiences," he repeated, and there was something in his tone that made it clear he understood exactly what kind of experiences she was referring to. His gaze shifted to Sergeant Patterson and the other members of the maintenance team, who were watching the exchange with growing curiosity, and Lena could see him calculating the risks of continuing this conversation in front of witnesses who lacked the necessary security clearance to understand what was really being discussed. Without another word, Colonel Nash began removing his uniform jacket, his movements deliberate and purposeful, in a way that captured the attention of everyone present. The jacket came off smoothly, revealing the standard-issue military undershirt that every Marine wore beneath their uniform. For a moment, it seemed like he was simply adjusting his clothing in response to the heat of the motor pool. Then he pulled the undershirt over his head, exposing his torso to the shocked stares of the maintenance team. On his left shoulder, rendered in the same faded black ink as Lena's tattoo, was an identical serpent wrapped around an identical compass rose. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant sounds of base operations that seemed to fade into irrelevance as everyone present tried to process what they were seeing. Sergeant Patterson's mouth opened and closed without producing any sound, while the other mechanics simply stared in bewilderment at their commanding officer's unexpected revelation. Nash's eyes never left Lena's face, as he stood there shirtless in the middle of the motor pool, his tattoo clearly visible to everyone present. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper, but every word carried the weight of shared experience and mutual recognition. "She's not logistics," he said, speaking to Sergeant Patterson, but looking directly at Lena. "She's former Unit Meridian. Only 6 of us made it out." The words hung in the air, like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that none of the witnesses could fully understand, but all of them could sense were profoundly significant. Lena felt something inside her chest tighten, a combination of relief and terror that came from having her carefully constructed cover blown by someone who had shared the same nightmare that had shaped the last several years of her life. Colonel Nash slowly put his undershirt back on, his movements careful and measured as he regained his composure. The brief moment of vulnerability had passed, but its impact continued to reverberate through the motor pool like ripples on a still pond. When he was fully dressed again, he turned to Sergeant Patterson with the kind of authoritative bearing that reminded everyone present of his rank and position. "Sergeant Patterson." "I need to speak with Brooks privately," he said, his voice carrying the unmistakable tone of a direct order. "The rest of you can continue with your duties, but I want it understood that what just happened here doesn't leave this motor pool. That's not a request." Patterson nodded quickly, his confusion evident, but his obedience absolute. "Yes, sir. You heard the Colonel. People back to work and keep your mouths shut about what you just saw." The maintenance team dispersed with the kind of reluctant efficiency that came from following orders they didn't entirely understand, casting curious glances back at Lena and Nash as they returned to their respective workstations. Within minutes, the motor pool had returned to its normal rhythm of activity, though the undercurrent of speculation was almost palpable in the air. Nash waited until they had relative privacy before speaking again, his voice low enough to avoid being overheard by the other mechanics. "We need to talk," he said simply, and Lena nodded her agreement, understanding that the conversation they were about to have would fundamentally alter the careful equilibrium she had maintained for years. "Your office, sir?" she asked, and there was something in her tone that suggested she understood the gravity of the situation they both found themselves in. Neither Nash replied. "There's a place on base where we can speak freely. Meet me at Building 47. Come alone and don't mention this conversation to anyone." Building 47 was located in a section of Camp Pendleton that most personnel rarely had occasion to visit, a nondescript structure that housed administrative offices and conference rooms used primarily for classified briefings and sensitive meetings. Lena arrived exactly as specified, her punctuality reflecting the military precision that had been drilled into her during years of service in units where timing could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Nash was already waiting for her in a small conference room on the second floor, a space that was notable for its lack of windows and the presence of electronic equipment that suggested it was regularly swept for surveillance devices. He had changed out of his uniform into civilian clothes, and the transformation made him seem somehow more human, less like a distant authority figure, and more like someone who had shared experiences that few other people could understand. "Close the door," he said as she entered, and Lena complied, before taking a seat across from him at the small conference table. For several moments, neither of them spoke, both seeming to struggle with the weight of recognition and the implications of what their mutual presence at Camp Pendleton might mean. Finally, Nash broke the silence. "I thought you were dead," he said, simply his voice carrying a mixture of relief and confusion that suggested the news of her survival was both welcome and unexpected. The after-action reports said there were only 5 survivors from the extraction. "Your name wasn't on any of the lists I saw." Lena nodded slowly, understanding now why her presence at Camp Pendleton had been such a shock to him. "Officially, I am dead," she replied. "At least, Lena Brooks is dead. The woman you knew in Unit Meridian was someone else entirely, and she died in those mountains, along with Walker and Chen." The mention of their fallen teammates brought a moment of silence to the room, a brief memorial to colleagues who had given their lives in service to operations that would never be acknowledged or honored in any public way. Nash's expression darkened with memories that were clearly still painful, and Lena could see that he, like her, carried the weight of survivor's guilt that came from walking away from situations where others hadn't been so fortunate. "What happened to you after the extraction?" Nash asked, his voice gentle but insistent. "I tried to track down everyone who made it out, but your trail went cold after the debriefing in Germany. It was like you simply vanished." "I was given a choice," Lena explained, her words careful and measured, as she navigated the sensitive details of her transition from covert operations to her current assignment. "The same choice all of us were given, I imagine: reassignment to a position where my knowledge could be contained and monitored, or face the possibility of more permanent solutions to the problem of what I knew." Nash nodded grimly, understanding the euphemistic language she was using to describe decisions that had been made at levels far above their respective pay grades. "I chose reassignment as well," he admitted, "though my path back to conventional military service was somewhat more direct than yours appears to have been." "They couldn't make me a colonel overnight without raising questions," Lena said with a bitter smile. "So they made me a mechanic instead. It's actually not a bad cover when you think about it. Nobody pays attention to the people who fix their vehicles, and the work is satisfying in its own way. But you're wasted here. Nash said, his frustration evident in his voice. The skills you demonstrated in Unit Meridian, the tactical knowledge, the operational experience, all of it is being squandered on routine maintenance work. Lena leaned back in her chair, studying Nash's face with the kind of careful attention she had once applied to intelligence briefings and threat assessments. With respect, sir, that's exactly the point. I'm not supposed to be using those skills anymore. I'm supposed to be safely contained in a position where I can't cause any embarrassment to the people who decided that Unit Meridian had become too much of a liability to continue supporting. The bitterness in her voice was unmistakable, a reflection of years spent coming to terms with the reality that her service to her country had been deemed inconvenient by people who had never faced the kinds of dangers she had willingly accepted as part of her duties. Nash seemed to recognize that bitterness, perhaps because he had experienced similar feelings during his own transition back to conventional military service. "How much do you know about why I'm here?" he asked, shifting the conversation in a direction that suggested he had information that might be relevant to her situation. "About my assignment to Camp Pendleton, I mean." "Nothing beyond the standard gossip," Lena admitted. "You requested the assignment after completing a tour in the Pacific. Impressive service record commendation from the Joint Chiefs, the usual credentials that come with colonel rank." Nash smiled humorlessly. "The truth is somewhat more complex than that. I didn't request this assignment. It was given to me just like your assignment to the motorpool was given to you. The difference is that my orders came with additional responsibilities that go beyond standard base command duties." Lena felt a familiar tension building in her chest, the kind of alertness that had once served her well in hostile environments where danger could emerge from unexpected directions. What kind of additional responsibilities? The kind that involve keeping track of former Unit Meridian personnel? Nash replied, his words carrying implications that were both reassuring and disturbing. "There are 6 of us scattered across different assignments, different bases, different branches of service. My job, among other things, is to monitor our welfare and ensure that we're all adjusting successfully to our new roles." "And if we're not adjusting successfully?" Lena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Then other arrangements would need to be made," Nash said simply, confirming her fears with the kind of bureaucratic language that was often used to describe decisions that were both final and irreversible. The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a heavy blanket, and Lena found herself reevaluating everything about her assignment to Camp Pendleton in light of this new information. She had assumed that her posting was simply a convenient way for the military to keep her out of trouble while making use of her technical skills. But Nash's presence suggested that the situation was far more complex and potentially dangerous than she had realized. "So you're here to watch me," she said, stating the obvious conclusion that followed from what he had told her. "Among other things," Nash confirmed. "Though I have to admit, I'm somewhat relieved to discover that you're adjusting as well as you appear to be. Your performance reports have been exemplary, and there's been no indication that you're having difficulty with the transition to civilian-style duties." "Because I've been very careful to give exactly that impression," Lena replied. "I understood from the beginning that my continued survival depended on convincing the right people that I was no longer a threat to anyone or anything." Nash leaned forward, his expression intense as he studied her face. "But that's not entirely true, is it? You are still a threat, just a carefully contained one. The skills you learned in Unit Meridian don't simply disappear because you're working on truck engines instead of classified operations." "No, they don't disappear," Lena agreed. "But I've become very good at pretending they don't exist. It's amazing how invisible you can become when people think they know exactly who you are and what you're capable of. The question is, Nash said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, what happens when circumstances arise that require those skills to be used again? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither of them was quite ready to address directly. Lena understood that Nash wasn't asking hypothetically, that there was something specific behind his inquiry that related to her current situation and his presence at Camp Pendleton. What circumstances, she asked, though the part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Intelligence suggests that someone is taking an interest in former Unit Meridian personnel, Nash finally said. Not official interest, not government agencies trying to keep track of us for administrative purposes. Someone else. Someone with resources and motivation to track down people who were involved in operations that officially never happened. Lena felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Who? We don't know yet, Nash admitted. The intelligence is fragmentary, mostly patterns of inquiry that intelligence analysts have noticed but can't yet explain. Someone has been asking questions about Unit Meridian, about specific operations, about personnel who were involved in classified activities during the time frame when we were operational. Questions asked, where of whom? Various sources, various methods. Nash replied. Some of it appears to be electronic surveillance data mining operations designed to identify connections between people and events that were supposed to remain classified. Some of it is more traditional human intelligence people making inquiries through channels that suggest significant resources and sophisticated operational capabilities. Lena processed this information with the kind of analytical mindset that had once made her invaluable in situations where incomplete intelligence had to be transformed into actionable operational plans. The implications of what Nash was telling her were disturbing on multiple levels, suggesting that the careful anonymity she had constructed around her new identity might not be as secure as she had believed. How long has this been going on? She asked. At least for some time, possibly longer, Nash replied. The patterns only became apparent recently when intelligence analysts began connecting data points that had previously seemed unrelated. That's when the decision was made to place former Unit Meridian personnel under closer observation to ensure their security and monitor for any signs that their covers might be compromised. Which explains your assignment here, Lena concluded. You're not just monitoring my adjustment to civilian duties. You're providing security in case whoever is asking these questions decides to take more direct action. Nash nodded grimly. That's part of it, yes, but there's more to it than simple protection. If this situation escalates, if whoever is behind these inquiries makes a move against any of us, we may need to respond with capabilities that go beyond what conventional military security can provide. Lena understood immediately what he was suggesting, and the prospect filled her with a mixture of anticipation and dread that she hadn't experienced since the day she had walked away from Unit Meridian for what she had believed would be the final time. You're talking about reactivating operational capabilities. I'm talking about the possibility that circumstances might require us to defend ourselves using skills that we haven't officially possessed for years, Nash corrected, though the distinction was largely semantic. The hope is that it won't come to that whatever this is will resolve itself through conventional intelligence channels. But we need to be prepared for the possibility that it won't. The conversation continued, with Nash providing additional details about the intelligence patterns that had triggered concern at the highest levels of military command. The picture that emerged was troubling but still incomplete, suggesting that someone with significant resources and sophisticated capabilities was systematically investigating Unit Meridian and its former personnel, for reasons that remained unclear. As they talked, Lena found herself slipping back into the analytical mindset that had once been second nature to her, evaluating threats and considering responses with the kind of professional detachment that had made her effective in situations where emotional reactions could prove fatal. It was both comforting and disturbing to discover that those skills remained as sharp as ever, despite years of deliberate disuse. When Nash finally indicated that their meeting was concluded, Lena felt as though she was emerging from a different world, one where the stakes were measured in terms of survival, rather than vehicle repair schedules and maintenance quotas. The transition back to her cover identity felt jarring, like putting on clothes that no longer quite fit properly. "What happens now?" she asked as they prepared to leave the conference room. "Now we wait," Nash replied. "You continue with your duties in the motorpool, and I continue with mine as base commander. We maintain our covers and watch for any signs that the situation is escalating. If something changes, if there are indications that immediate action is required, I'll contact you through secure channels. And if our covers are blown, if whoever is asking these questions decides to take direct action." Nash's expression was grim, but determined. "Then we remind them why Unit Meridian was considered so effective that it had to be officially disbanded, rather than simply reassigned." They left Building 47 separately, Nash departing first while Lena waited several minutes before following him out into the California afternoon. The sun was still shining. The base was still functioning with its normal rhythm of organized chaos. And on the surface, nothing had changed from the morning when her biggest concern had been replacing a transmission in a transport truck. But underneath that surface, normalcy, everything was different now. The careful equilibrium she had maintained for years had been shattered by the recognition in Nash's eyes and the information he had shared about threats that might be gathering in the shadows beyond the relative safety of Camp Pendleton. She was no longer simply Lena Brooks' motorpool mechanic, trying to blend in and avoid notice until she could transition to civilian life. She was once again a former member of Unit Meridian, with all the dangers and responsibilities that identity carried. The return to the motorpool felt surreal, like stepping back into a play where she had been performing a role so convincingly that she had almost forgotten it was a performance. Sergeant Patterson looked up as she approached her workstation, his expression curious, but professional, as he asked about her meeting with the colonel. "Just routine administrative stuff," she lied smoothly, the deception coming as naturally as breathing after years of practice. Colonel Nash wanted to discuss some changes to maintenance scheduling procedures. Patterson nodded, accepting the explanation without question, though Lena could see that he was still puzzling over the incident with the tattoos that had precipitated her private meeting with the commanding officer. She could hardly blame him for his curiosity, since the whole episode had been bizarre enough to generate questions that wouldn't be easily satisfied by routine explanations. The rest of the day passed in a haze of mechanical tasks that felt both familiar and strange, as if she was performing activities that belonged to someone else's life, while her mind processed the implications of what Nash had told her. Every routine interaction with her colleagues carried new weight, every casual conversation a potential security risk that needed to be evaluated and managed. That evening, alone in her quarters, Lena found herself staring at the tattoo on her forearm with new eyes. For years it had been a burden, a visible reminder of a past she was trying to leave behind. Now it had become something else entirely, a signal that had identified her to someone who shared the same dangerous history and who might be the key to her survival if the threats Nash had described proved to be real. She traced the outline of the serpent with her fingertip, remembering the night she had received it in a makeshift tattoo parlor, in a town whose name she couldn't pronounce, part of the ritual that had bound her to 5 other people, in ways that transcended normal military service. They had been a team, a family united by shared dangers and mutual trust, in situations where the margin for error was measured in heartbeats and the consequences of failure were always fatal. 3 of them were dead, now casualties of operations that would never be acknowledged or honored in any official capacity. The 3 survivors had been scattered to different assignments, different lives, different identities that were supposed to keep them safe from the consequences of what they had done in service to their country. Now Nash was telling her that safety might be an illusion, that someone was actively hunting them for reasons that remained unclear. The prospect should have terrified her, but instead she found herself experiencing something closer to relief. For years, she had been living a lie, pretending to be someone she wasn't, suppressing instincts and abilities that had once defined her entire existence. The possibility of returning to that world, even under dangerous circumstances, carried an appeal that she found both disturbing and undeniable. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by dreams that blended memories of past operations with anxieties about future threats. She found herself reliving moments from that final mission, the one that had cost them 2 teammates and effectively ended Unit Meridian as an operational entity. The sound of helicopter rotors struggling against thin mountain air, the weight of equipment that seemed designed to slow them down at exactly the moment when speed was most crucial. The faces of local contacts who had promised support but delivered betrayal instead. She woke before dawn, as had become her habit, and lay in the darkness listening to the sounds of a military base, preparing for another day of routine operations. Somewhere in the distance, drill instructors were already putting recruits through morning physical training, their voices carrying across the base with the kind of relentless authority that transformed civilians into Marines through sheer repetition and gradually increasing demands. The routine of her morning preparations felt different now, charged with the kind of awareness that had once been essential for survival in hostile environments. She found herself checking sightlines as she moved through the barracks, noting potential exits and evaluating the defensive capabilities of structures that she had previously regarded as simple functional buildings. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, as if recognition of her true identity had awakened instincts that had been dormant, but never truly eliminated. The motorpool seemed different too, though the changes were largely in her perception rather than in any objective alteration of the physical environment. She found herself cataloging the location of tools that could serve as improvised weapons, identifying vehicles that could provide cover or concealment in case of hostile action, calculating fields of fire and escape routes with the kind of automatic tactical assessment that had once been as natural as breathing. Sergeant Patterson noticed the change in her demeanor almost immediately, though he seemed unable to identify exactly what was different about her behavior. "You seem distracted today, Brooks," he observed as she began her morning inspection of assigned vehicles. "Everything okay, just thinking about some things the colonel mentioned yesterday," she replied, which was true enough to satisfy her conscience, while revealing nothing of substance about the actual nature of her concerns. New maintenance procedures can be complicated to implement properly. Patterson nodded, accepting the explanation while continuing to study her with the kind of careful attention that good non-commissioned officers developed after years of managing personnel, who might not always be entirely forthcoming about their personal situations. "Well, if you need any help working through the complications, let me know. I've been dealing with changing procedures for longer than I care to admit." The morning passed quietly, with Lena dividing her attention between routine maintenance tasks and the kind of environmental surveillance that had once been essential for detecting threats before they could develop into active dangers. She found herself paying attention to personnel movements around the motor pool, noting patterns of activity that could provide cover for surveillance or hostile action, cataloging the daily rhythms of base operations in ways that would have seemed paranoid to her colleagues, but felt perfectly natural given her current concerns. It was during her lunch break, while sitting alone in a corner of the base cafeteria, where she could observe the room while eating, that she noticed the man who didn't quite belong. He was dressed in civilian clothes that were just a little too neat, too carefully chosen to blend in with the mix of off-duty military personnel and civilian contractors who frequented the cafeteria during lunch hours. His hair was regulation short, despite his civilian status, and he moved with a kind of controlled precision that suggested military training, though something about his bearing indicated that he wasn't currently serving in any official capacity. More importantly, he was watching her. The surveillance was professional, sophisticated enough that most people would never have noticed it. But Lena's training had included extensive instruction in counter-surveillance techniques, and she recognized the subtle signs of someone conducting systematic observation. The man's position in the cafeteria allowed him to monitor her table while appearing to focus on his own meal, and his movements were timed to avoid direct eye contact while maintaining visual contact with her general location. Lena continued eating at a normal pace, giving no indication that she had detected the surveillance, while using the reflective surfaces around the cafeteria to gather additional information about her observer. He appeared to be alone, though that didn't mean he was operating without support, and his equipment suggested access to resources that went beyond what would be available to casual curiosity seekers or amateur investigators. The situation presented her with several options, none of them particularly appealing. She could attempt to evade surveillance by varying her routine and using the base's complex layout to lose any followers. But that would only work temporarily and might alert her observers to the fact that she was aware of their presence. She could confront the man directly using the public setting of the cafeteria to force him into an uncomfortable position, but that carried the risk of escalating a situation that might be better handled through more subtle means. Or she could contact Nash and let him know that the theoretical threats he had described might be becoming very real indeed. She chose the third option, finishing her lunch at a normal pace before disposing of her tray and leaving the cafeteria through the main entrance. The man didn't follow immediately, but she caught a glimpse of him speaking into what appeared to be a cell phone as she exited the building, confirming her suspicion that he was part of a larger surveillance operation. The walk back to the motor pool took her through several areas of the base, where surveillance would be difficult to maintain without becoming obvious, and she used the opportunity to conduct her own counter-surveillance checking for additional observers while appearing to follow her normal routine. By the time she reached her workstation, she was confident that she wasn't being directly followed, though that didn't mean the surveillance had been abandoned entirely. Sergeant Patterson was waiting for her when she arrived, his expression indicating that something significant had occurred during her absence. "Brooks, Colonel Nash wants to see you in his office immediately," he said, his tone suggesting that the summons was both urgent and unexpected. "He said to tell you, it's about the maintenance procedures you discussed yesterday." The coded reference to their previous conversation made it clear that Nash was aware of some development that required immediate attention, and Lena felt her pulse quicken with the kind of anticipatory tension that had once preceded dangerous operations in hostile territory. Did he say anything else? Just that you should come alone and not mention the meeting to anyone else? Patterson replied, echoing the security protocols that Nash had established during their previous encounter. Same as yesterday. Lena nodded, understanding that the situation had escalated beyond routine monitoring and into the realm of active threat management. I'll head over there now. If anyone asks where I am, tell them I'm dealing with administrative issues related to the new maintenance protocols. The walk to Nash's office felt longer than usual, and Lena attributed that to the heightened state of alertness that made her acutely aware of every detail of her surroundings. She found herself automatically cataloging potential threats and defensive positions, the kind of tactical assessment that had once been essential for survival in environments where danger could emerge without warning from any direction. Nash's office was located in the base headquarters building, a structure that provided both security and privacy for sensitive conversations while maintaining the appearance of routine administrative activities. When Lena arrived, Nash's aide directed her immediately into his private office, where the colonel was waiting with the kind of tense energy that suggested significant developments had occurred since their previous meeting. "Close the door," Nash said as she entered, and Lena complied before taking a seat across from his desk. The office was larger than the conference room where they had met previously, but it had the same electronic security features that indicated regular sweeps for surveillance devices and protection against eavesdropping. "We have a problem," Nash said without preamble, his directness confirming Lena's suspicion that the situation had moved beyond theoretical concerns into the realm of immediate threats. "Intelligence intercepted communications this morning that suggest someone is preparing to take direct action against former Unit Meridian personnel." Lena felt her stomach tighten with the kind of anticipatory dread that accompanied the transition from relative safety to active danger. What kind of direct action? The intelligence is fragmentary, but it appears that someone has compiled detailed profiles of all surviving Unit Meridian members, including current assignments, cover identities, and operational capabilities. The communications suggest that these profiles are being distributed to operational teams for purposes that haven't been clearly identified. Operational teams, belonging to whom Nash's expression was grim. "That's the problem. We don't know yet." The communications were encrypted using methods that suggest significant technical sophistication, and the language patterns indicate involvement by people with professional intelligence training. But there's no clear indication of whether this is a government operation, a private intelligence organization, or something else entirely. Lena processed this information with the kind of analytical detachment that had once served her well in situations where emotional reactions could prove fatal. The implications were disturbing on multiple levels, suggesting that her carefully constructed anonymity had been compromised and that threats might be imminent rather than theoretical. "How compromised is my cover?" she asked, focusing on the immediate practical concerns that would determine her available options. "Completely," Nash replied bluntly. "The profiles include detailed information about your current assignment, your living arrangements, your daily routines, everything someone would need to locate and target you with minimal difficulty." The news should have been devastating, but instead, Lena found herself experiencing something closer to relief. The uncertainty that had characterized her situation for years was finally resolved, replaced by the kind of clear and immediate danger that she was trained to handle. The prospect of returning to active operational status, even under hostile circumstances, felt more natural than the extended period of enforced civilian normalcy she had endured since leaving Unit Meridian. "What about the other survivors?" she asked. "Harper is at Fort Bragg working in intelligence analysis. Jackson is assigned to a logistics unit in Germany. Both of their covers have been similarly compromised, and we're implementing protective measures for all surviving Unit Meridian personnel as of this morning. Nash paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully, before continuing. The problem is that conventional protective measures may not be sufficient for the kind of threats we are facing. If these operational teams are staffed by people with professional intelligence training, they'll be prepared to deal with standard military security protocols. Lena understood immediately what he was suggesting. You're talking about proactive measures. I'm talking about the possibility that our best defense might be to take offensive action against whoever is targeting us. Nash confirmed. We can't simply hide and hope that the threat goes away, not when our opponents have resources and capabilities that match or exceed our own. The prospect of returning to active operations filled Lena with a complex mixture of anticipation and apprehension that she hadn't experienced since the day she had walked away from Unit Meridian for what she had believed would be the final time. The skills she had spent years suppressing suddenly seemed vitally relevant again. The instincts she had been forced to ignore were once again essential for survival. What kind of offensive action, she asked the part of her that already knew the answer. The kind that Unit Meridian was created to handle, Nash replied. Targets that conventional military forces can't touch. Operations that require capabilities beyond what regular special operations units can provide. Missions that officially don't exist, but are essential for protecting American interests. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on either of them. Unit Meridian had been disbanded because its operations had become too politically sensitive for official support. But now those same capabilities were needed to protect the unit's former members from threats that conventional military resources couldn't address effectively. Who else knows about this? Lena asked, understanding that the success of any operation would depend on maintaining security while assembling the necessary resources and personnel. At this point, just the two of us and a small number of intelligence analysts who are coordinating threat assessment and protective measures, Nash replied. The decision about whether to authorize more aggressive responses will be made at levels far above our respective pay grades, but we need to be prepared to act quickly if that authorization comes through. Nash opened a locked drawer in his desk and withdrew a sealed envelope, which he placed on the desk between them. These are preliminary operational parameters compiled by people who understand what Unit Meridian was capable of and what might be required to address the current threat. The contents are classified at levels that officially don't exist, and reading them constitutes acceptance of operational responsibility under conditions that haven't been fully defined yet. Lena stared at the envelope for several seconds, understanding that opening it would represent a point of no return in her transition back to active operational status. The woman who had spent years fixing trucks and avoiding attention would cease to exist, replaced by someone who had once been considered among the most dangerous individuals in the American military establishment. The choice should have been difficult, but it wasn't. The moment Nash had revealed his tattoo in the motorpool, her old life had effectively ended, and her original identity had begun reasserting itself with increasing intensity. The prospect of returning to work that utilized her full capabilities, even under dangerous circumstances, was more appealing than continuing to suppress her true nature for the sake of an anonymity that had already been compromised. She reached for the envelope. The documents inside were formatted with the kind of clinical precision that characterized high-level intelligence briefings, dense with technical details and operational parameters that painted a picture of threats that were both immediate and sophisticated. The targeting profiles that had been compiled on former Unit Meridian personnel were remarkably comprehensive, suggesting access to classified databases and surveillance capabilities that exceeded what most government agencies could deploy for routine operations. More disturbing was the evidence of coordination between multiple operational teams, indicating that the threat wasn't limited to a single organization or geographical area. Someone with significant resources had assembled a systematic campaign against Unit Meridian survivors, using methods that suggested both professional capabilities and personal motivation that went beyond simple intelligence gathering. "Any theories about who's behind this?" Lena asked after finishing her review of the documents. "Several. None of them particularly comforting," Nash replied. "It could be a foreign intelligence service seeking revenge for Unit Meridian operations that damaged their interests. It could be a private organization with connections to people or groups that were targeted during our operational period. It could even be elements within our own government who decided that loose ends needed to be tied up permanently." The last possibility was perhaps the most disturbing, suggesting that the very people who had once directed Unit Meridian operations might now consider the unit's former members to be liabilities that required elimination. It wouldn't be the first time that intelligence operatives had been abandoned or actively targeted by their own agencies when political considerations outweighed loyalty to personnel who had served faithfully under dangerous conditions. "What's the timeline for a decision about operational authorization?" Lena asked, understanding that their window for proactive measures might be limited by the speed with which hostile forces were moving against them. "Hours, not days," Nash replied grimly. "Intelligence suggests that whatever these operational teams are planning, they're moving toward implementation rapidly. We may not have the luxury of extended planning and preparation that characterized Unit Meridian operations." Lena nodded, accepting the reality that any action they took would need to be decisive and effective, despite limited preparation time. The skills that had made Unit Meridian effective hadn't disappeared during her years in the motorpool, but they had been dormant, unused in situations where the stakes were measured in life and death, rather than vehicle repair schedules and maintenance quotas. "If authorization comes through, what assets will be available?" she asked, shifting into the kind of operational planning mindset that had once been second nature. Nash opened another drawer and withdrew a second envelope, this one marked with security classifications that indicated access to resources that went beyond conventional military capabilities. Everything that Unit Meridian had access to previously, plus some additional capabilities that have been developed since our operational period ended. The implication was clear: if the situation escalated to the point where offensive operations were authorized, they would have access to the same level of support that had made Unit Meridian so effective during its original operational period. The prospect was both reassuring and sobering, indicating the seriousness with which the threat was being regarded at the highest levels of the intelligence community. Their conversation was interrupted by Nash's secure phone, which emitted the kind of distinctive tone that indicated communications from classified sources. Nash answered on the second ring, his voice taking on the formal tone that suggested he was speaking with someone of significant authority. "Yes, sir," he said, after listening for several minutes. "Understood. We'll be ready to implement immediately upon confirmation." When he hung up, his expression was grim but determined. That was confirmation that hostile operational teams are moving against Unit Meridian survivors. Harper's apartment in North Carolina was under surveillance as of this morning, and Jackson's routine in Germany has been mapped by people who appear to be preparing for direct action. Lena felt her pulse quicken with the familiar combination of anticipation and apprehension that had once preceded dangerous operations in hostile territory, and authorization for proactive measures. Pending but expected within the next few hours. Nash replied. In the meantime, we're authorized to implement immediate protective measures and begin operational preparations. The transformation from motorpool mechanic to active operative felt surreal but natural, as if she was finally returning to an identity that had always been her true self, despite years of careful pretense. The skills that had been dormant began reasserting themselves with increasing intensity, tactical awareness replacing the comfortable routine of mechanical maintenance, operational planning, displacing concerns about vehicle repair schedules. What about our covers here on base? She asked, understanding that their sudden disappearance from routine duties would generate questions that might compromise operational security. Already handled, Nash replied. As of this afternoon, you're temporarily assigned to special duties that require you to be unavailable for routine motorpool operations. Sergeant Patterson has been told that you're participating in a classified maintenance evaluation that will keep you occupied for an indefinite period. The efficiency with which her cover transition had been arranged indicated that preparations for this possibility had been ongoing for some time, suggesting that the threats against Unit Meridian survivors had been anticipated and planned for at levels far above her current security clearance. The realization was both comforting and disturbing, indicating that she was part of a larger operational framework, while reminding her that her individual survival was just one element in a complex strategic situation. Nash stood up from behind his desk, his movement signaling that their briefing was concluded and operational preparations were beginning. There's a secure facility on base, where we can prepare without risking exposure to hostile surveillance. I'll take you there now, and we can begin reviewing current intelligence and operational parameters. The walk to the secure facility took them through sections of Camp Pendleton that Lena had never seen during her years as a motorpool mechanic, areas that were clearly restricted to personnel with special clearances and operational responsibilities that went beyond conventional military duties. The buildings were nondescript from the outside, but the security measures protecting them indicated that sensitive activities were conducted within their walls on a regular basis. The facility Nash led her to was located in a basement level that appeared to have been constructed specifically for classified operations, with electronic security measures that exceeded anything Lena had encountered during her previous Unit Meridian service. The main operations room was equipped with communications equipment, tactical displays, and computer systems that suggested access to intelligence resources from across the American national security establishment. Welcome back to the world of officially non-existent operations, Nash said as they entered the facility. I know it's been years since you've worked in this kind of environment, but I suspect you'll find that the essential requirements haven't changed much. Lena surveyed the operations room with the kind of professional assessment that had once been automatic noting capabilities and limitations, while beginning to think in terms of mission parameters and operational objectives. The transition from her cover identity felt complete now, as if the woman who had spent years fixing trucks had been revealed as an elaborate disguise that was no longer necessary. The next several hours were spent reviewing intelligence reports, threat assessments, and preliminary operational plans that painted a comprehensive picture of the dangers facing Unit Meridian survivors and the resources available to address those threats. The scope of the hostile operation was broader than Lena had initially realized, involving multiple teams operating in different countries with coordination that suggested significant organizational capabilities and financial resources. More disturbing was the evidence that their opponents possessed detailed knowledge of Unit Meridian operational methods and capabilities, suggesting either access to classified files or information provided by someone with intimate knowledge of the unit's history and personnel. The possibility of betrayal by someone within the American intelligence community added an additional layer of complexity to an already dangerous situation. As evening approached, Nash received the communication they had been waiting for. Authorization for proactive operations had been approved at the highest levels, with parameters that essentially restored Unit Meridian to active status for the duration of the current crisis. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, that a unit that had been disbanded for political reasons was being reactivated to address threats that conventional military forces couldn't handle effectively. "So we're officially operational again?" Lena asked after Nash had briefed her on the authorization details. As official as Unit Meridian ever was, Nash replied with a bitter smile. "Which means that if something goes wrong, we'll be disavowed just as quickly as we're being reactivated now." The familiar pattern of official support combined with plausible deniability was exactly what Lena had expected, but it still carried a sting of betrayal that reminded her why she had been so willing to accept exile to motorpool duty rather than continue serving in operations where loyalty was a luxury that political considerations couldn't always afford. But now she was back, whether by choice or necessity, and the skills that had made her valuable to Unit Meridian were once again essential for survival. The woman who had spent years pretending to be someone else was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the only way to protect the life she had built was to temporarily abandon it in favor of capabilities that she had hoped never to use again. The operation that followed would test every skill she had learned during her years with Unit Meridian, while forcing her to confront the reality that some identities once assumed could never be completely abandoned. The tattoo on her forearm had always been more than decorative art. It was a permanent reminder that some commitments transcended individual choice, and that some responsibilities could only be discharged through actions that officially never occurred. As Nash began outlining the preliminary operational parameters for their response to the threats against Unit Meridian survivors, Lena felt the last vestiges of her cover identity fade away, replaced by the cold professional competence that had once made her among the most feared operatives in the American intelligence establishment. The motorpool mechanic was gone, and in her place stood someone who understood that the only way to ensure her future safety was to eliminate the threats that had forced her back into a world she had tried to leave behind. The serpent tattoo had always represented the cyclical nature of her existence, the way that attempts to escape her past inevitably led back to the same dangerous realities that had shaped her original identity. Now, as she prepared to return to active operations, under circumstances that were both familiar and entirely new, she understood that the compass wrapped within the serpent's coils wasn't just decorative symbolism. It was a reminder that no matter how far she traveled from her origins, she would always find her way back to the same essential truth about who she was and what she was capable of when survival required her to abandon pretense in favor of lethal competence. The mission ahead would determine whether that return to her true identity represented salvation or destruction. But either way, Lena Brooks, the motorpool mechanic, was gone forever, replaced by someone whose very existence was a carefully maintained fiction designed to protect secrets that were too dangerous for official acknowledgement. As she reviewed the operational files that would govern her return to active duty, Lena realized that the mockery she had endured about her tattoo had been more prophetic than anyone could have imagined. The faded serpent wrapped around the compass hadn't been a meaningless decoration or a youthful mistake. It was a warning about the cyclical nature of identity and the impossibility of truly escaping from obligations that were written into the very fabric of who she was. Now, as hostile forces closed in on the survivors of a unit that had officially never existed, that warning was about to be validated in ways that would test every skill she had learned and every limit she had accepted during her years of service to operations that demanded everything while promising nothing in return. The woman who had once moved through shadows in places most people couldn't pronounce was back. And this time, there would be no motorpool to hide in when the mission was complete. In the gripping tale of Lena Brooks, a seemingly ordinary mechanic at Camp Pendleton, whose faded serpent tattoo became the butt of endless jokes, we uncover a profound life lesson that resonates deeply with all of us. Never judge someone by their exterior or the fragments of their story you see on the surface. Lena, with her grease-stained hands and quiet demeanor, endured mockery from recruits who dismissed her ink as a garage special, oblivious to the fact that it symbolized her harrowing past in Unit Meridian, a shadowy elite team where she faced unimaginable dangers, lost comrades, and survived missions that officially never happened. When Colonel Nash revealed his identical tattoo, stripping away the facade, it shattered assumptions and revealed Lena's true heroism, forcing her back into a world of threats and high-stakes operations. This story tugs at our hearts, reminding us of the hidden battles people fight every day, the scars, both visible and invisible, that shape who we are. In real life, how many times have we dismissed a coworker, a stranger, or even a loved one based on superficial traits, only to later discover their depth, resilience, and untold sacrifices? It's a poignant call to empathy. Behind every ordinary person might lie extraordinary courage forged in fires we can't comprehend. This lesson evokes raw emotion, regret for past judgments, admiration for quiet warriors, and a humbling gratitude for the complexities of human experience. It urges us to pause, listen, and honor the stories etched in others' lives, fostering kindness in a world quick to label. What about you? Have you ever misjudged someone only to learn their incredible backstory? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories and reflections. If this moved, you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another inspiring tale that could change how you see the world. Let's build a community of understanding together.